Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on the latest episode of Ancient Near East Meets Modern West. I'm your host, Samuel David, and on today's episode, I'm joined by special guest Prisca Long. Prisca is a member of the Choctaw Nation. She is a priestess of Inanna. She's also a spiritual mentor and thought leader within 21st century goddess spirituality movement. She has more than 30 years experience in the magical arts, including traditional witchcraft, Western ceremonialism, and Taoist spiritual alchemy. She was also an early leader in the Mesopotamian polytheist community and is now a member of the Temple of Inanna leadership team. And her work can be found in the recent release of the Inannanthology.
Hi, Sam.
Hi, Prisca. It's so good to see you. Thank you for
It's
joining
great
me
to be
today.
here. I'm so happy to be
S-
here.
I'm happy that you are here because the last interview that I had, we kind of name dropped you here and there, and
I bragged about it on the internet.
materialized. You materialized from the ether. I don't know about you, but I always like to start with the quote unquote origin story. I know that in the esoteric community, the occult community, neo pagan community, what have you, the majority of members of this subculture, because it is a subculture, we like to know other people's journeys and where they came from, what makes them tick, what was that defining moment in our lives that brought us to the position that we're in. So, having said that, would you like to provide a Cliff Notes version?
Sure. Let's see. I come from a part of East Texas called the Big Thicket, which is generally considered to be the weird part of Texas. It is as close to Louisiana as you can get and not actually be in Louisiana. And it's a region which is, of course, deeply Christian, but I think that things that we would now call magic are also very accepted in many ways. I think I really was always kind of a spiritual person. I think that I was really always very in touch with nature and spirits and animals. And um, people who were raising me as a child have all these stories, like, not just my parents, but my grandparents and my stepmother and all these people have all these stories about things I would do or say that like I would tell them something and it would come true, or I would have a dream and it would happen. And so I think I was always really on this path um, as a magical person. Um, and I think it probably runs in my family. I am indigenous from my father's side, and my father was also able to talk to spirits, which is not something I really consider myself. I don't really do. I don't really consider myself a medium. Um, but he also had some gifts of premonition as well. So I think I probably inherited it from him and his side of the family. And I was always I was raised Catholic. So there's like a mystical element there. And I was always just very in touch with the natural world. And when I became aware of Inanna, specifically when I was about 13, um, although I think she was probably in my life for many years before that, but I first became aware of her when I was about 13, and it was literally, so that would have been late 1989 or early 1990, and I was literally lying in bed, unable to sleep as I typically was, and I started hearing her name. Um, and I didn't really know who Inanna was at that time. But then I began learning about goddess spirituality, and um, at the time it was often called women's spirituality or feminist spirituality, and eventually, and I felt very drawn to that, to goddess worship and goddess religion, and eventually learned that Inanna was a goddess. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, this is my goddess. That's who she is. And Pretty much went on from there, learning as much as I could, checking out books from the library, um, reading as much as I could, and really trying to build that relationship with the divine, which I think has always been my inclination.
And you've been quite an active member, in my estimation, within the Mesopotamian esoterics spiritual community. And I know that that involvement predates Facebook. So we're talking, back in the days of Yahoo groups and platforms like LiveJournal and Zanga, and I don't know, I could list a million more that most folks today probably would have no clue of.
It's true.
Probably AOL message boards as well. What were those days like for you?
Um, they were actually pretty awesome for me, really, because it was my first opportunity to connect with pagans outside of my local sphere. And in Texas, there are a lot of pagans. I can definitely say we have a huge, massive pagan community here. People are very surprised by that. But Texas in general, and my city in particular, has so many pagans. But I really was not encountering anyone who had really the same, I would say, religious inclinations that I had. A lot of it was either Wicca or Wicca-esque, which there's not anything wrong with that. It's just not the same thing that I believe. Or that I pursue. And so I felt very lonely. And I was not able to find anyone who was attempting to practice ancient Mesopotamian religion. And it was actually on LiveJournal that I first started trying to find this community of people. And I started a group on LiveJournal called Sumerian Pagan. And with the intention really of finding other people who wanted to practice Sumerian reconstructionist polytheism. And that was pretty great, actually. I do want to mention in particular two women who were really instrumental to supporting me in that work. And that is my friend Kiwi, who is a pagan devotee of Ishtar, and another woman named Pamela, who was a devotee of Nisaba and was also an ABD Assyriologist. And these women were so instrumental and supportive in building this community. And so the three of us were really kind of the backbone of creating that group on LiveJournal. And it was never very big because we're a pretty small niche in the overall pagan or polytheist community in general. But it was great to be able to connect with other people. And I think really one of the key aspects of religion is community. Religion is not, historically, religion has not been a solitary pursuit. And it was very meaningful to me and really comforting in a way to meet other people who, well, none of us have exactly the same beliefs. We had their same values and pursuits and goals and what we wanted out of our polytheistic experience.
Kiwi's name sounds familiar, and I don't want to mention the surname that I think they have because, privacy reasons. What was the development like with these two individuals who helped you create this small community?
Well, Kiwi in many ways was almost like a mother or older sister to me. As a devotee of Ishtar, they were very active in practice and very active in their local pagan community. And so they were just very supportive and also helped to kind of help build that community. So it wasn't just me shouting into the void on LiveJournal. I wasn't the only person posting, and I wasn't the only person interested. And Pamela was really invaluable because she could jump in and supply accurate historical information and reading suggestions, book lists, things like that, which was really great for those of us who didn't have access academically. This was 2000 and 2001 approximately. So at that time, almost all Assyriology was in German. So if you did not read German and were not connected to an academic institution, you really didn't have access to academic texts. So most of us who were not academics were just going with, let's see, we had Diane Wolkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer's book, and we had Betty DeJong Meader's books. Those were some of the only books that as a layperson, one could get at a typical bookstore or
Yeah,
library in
yeah,
the USA.
absolutely.
When I was in high school, I had checked out a lot of books on Assyriology from my local library, but um, they were all old. They were all relatively old, and they were all written. They were anthropological books, but they were all written from a very dry and, for lack of a better term, Judeo-Christian point of view. They, like, for example, when they would translate god names, it would say a god, the god of air, but then a goddess would be a lady, the lady of this. So Inanna was
God
in
forbid a
these
woman should
books.
have power and
Yes,
also be a
and
deity.
yes, so in these books, Inanna was the lady of heaven. You know, um, so we really didn't have a lot of academic sources, and Pamela was really invaluable in providing that information. And I actually distinctly remember someone once trying to argue with her, and she said, "This is my role in this community." And I was so impressed with that, that she was able to just, own that and claim that and say, "No, this is my role in this community. I provide accurate historical information." And that was just amazing. And they were
I
just great
feel
supportive
that
people.
I feel that especially veracity to a historical culture or historical, let me backtrack what I'm going to say here. Let me think about my words and chew them before I spit them out. That has
Ew.
become my, I don't want to say a hill that I'm going to die on, but that has become something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and it's upholding the historicity of a practice and a culture from which we derive a spiritual practice. And I think that's perhaps one of the challenges that the Reconstruction community faces, is that there's this misconception that to be a Reconstructionist is to uphold some semblance of orthodoxy or orthopraxy and have little in the way of room for interpretation.
I agree. I think that is kind of, I think that is a prevailing attitude, and I think it has been in the past. And I think one reason for that was that early Reconstructionists were really seeking to differentiate themselves from neo-pagans in a big way. Um, you know, Back when I started the Sumerian pagan group on LiveJournal, this was a time when people were still claiming that Wicca was a thousands of years old ancient religion and
That
really
old
didn't like
chestnut.
being told otherwise. Um, it was just a really different time in paganism, and also a lot of people still promoted, the ancient peaceful matriarchy story, you know, that it, for those who are watching it have blessedly never heard of this. A lot of pagans used to believe that at some point in prehistory, all humans were very, very peaceful and worshiped the goddess and worshiped a great goddess and lived in a matriarchal community. And then patriarchy came along and ruined it all and made us evil and warlike. Um, so this was something that was still being really heavily promoted. And I think in a big way, a lot of the earliest Reconstructionists really wanted to differentiate themselves from neo-pagans. And so there was this kind of strict orthodoxy, this idea of adherence to, if it's not written in an ancient book, then it's not true and it's not right. And this idea that we have to necessarily believe and do everything exactly the same way that ancient people did. And of course, the pitfall there is that we're learning now so many different things about what ancient people knew and believed. And A lot of it was different than we thought it was 20 years ago. And a lot of it was different from what the ancient people 10 miles away knew and didn't believe. And that's the thing about reconstructionism is that we are reconstructing these practices in a way that is relevant and meaningful and attainable and accessible in our modern lives. So we're not going to be doing things exactly the same way as they did them in ancient Mesopotamia.
Because if we did, then it would no longer be reconstruction, it would be reenactment. And
Yes.
that
Yes.
comes with its whole other a whole other set of baggage to unpack. You have said this in various forums, online discourse, and it's a theory that I also subscribe to, and circling back to the conceptions that we have of culture, many who come to know Inanna do so through the descent myth. And that's where I was introduced. I was introduced to the figure of Inanna as a deity through the descent myth. But she has so many more myths that are often overlooked. And one of those myths is the account of her acquiring the May, or the tools of civilization, or the divine measures, as I've referred to them, from the god Enki, she being the patron deity of Uruk, and Enki being the patron deity of Eridu. And when we look at the historical record, there is this transference of power from one city to the next throughout history. But within the course of that myth, there are some narrative plot points that seem to, in my estimation, get lost in the mix. And I think that we bring these preconceived notions into the dynamic between these two powers. And I know that this is a passion project of yours, to say the least, that Inanna did not trick Enki. There's a lot more to this story than mere trickery alone.
Yes, that is true. And I'd like to take a moment to plug the Inannanthology, because I do have an essay in the Inannanthology all about this. And it's called From Eridu to Uruk, Inanna's Initiatory Journey. And if we look at this story, yes, it is absolutely a story about transfer of power from the city of Eridu to the city of Uruk. But one thing I was very surprised to learn when I started actually looking into this story is that the original texts do not support the idea that Inanna stole the May from Enki, or that she tricked him, or that she, one thing I often hear people say is that they were in a drinking competition. And it turns out that is actually not supported by the original text either. They were drinking, but it is
As
my
was customary
opinion.
for
Yeah,
dignitaries
yes,
exchanging,
yes. Inanna was welcomed as a guest. And so, of course, Inanna is like, bring out the beer, let's do it. Um, so, yes, they were drinking. One thing to remember is that Mesopotamian beer was very weak. Okay. We are not talking about very strong beer. We're talking about mildly alcoholic porridge, basically, which is why they had the very long straws to drink it from, because there would be meal floating on the surface of this brewly type alcoholic beverage, and the straws would go past that into the bottom to get to the liquid. But there was, as far as we can tell, there is no trickery, there's no stealing, and it's my opinion that what we're actually looking at is a story of initiation. One thing we can see if you look at translations of the text, or if you look at the original cuneiform, which I did ask a friend to look at the original cuneiform to make sure that I was interpreting this correctly. But the entire story is really structured as an initiation. Inanna goes to Eridu and she walks on foot. She walks to, and it says that very plainly, that she walks on her own 2 feet alone to Eridu. Enki welcomes her as a guest. He brings her sweet cakes, he brings her beer, and they start having a debate. There was no drinking contest, there was no theft. I don't know why Kramer decided to say that Inanna stole the May. It seems that this idea originated with Kramer, and I really don't know why, but it's just not supported by the cuneiform. But if you look at this, for example, the word being translated as competition, which a lot of people say was a drinking contest, which Kramer seems to have originated was a drinking contest, actually is aramin, and it usually means a debate or an argument in Sumerian. It doesn't actually mean a drinking contest. It doesn't mean a contest of that sort. It means a debate or an argument. And at this point, about 35 lines are missing, so we don't know what they were debating about, actually. But what we do see is that Enki chooses to give Inanna the May, and he does it using what is, in my opinion, an incantation. And he says, in the name of my power, in the name of my Abzu, I will give this to holy Inanna, my daughter. And so I think this has been a misinterpretation. I think that when Enki is giving Inanna the May, he is speaking a magical formula. So he gives Inanna many, many May. She takes the May, she hops in the boat of heaven. And I think that's very important because she came to Eridu on foot, but she leaves in the boat of heaven. She leaves in the boat of heaven with the May. And then Enki supposedly decides that he wants the May back, and he calls his minister Izimud. And he sends Izimud after Inanna to tell her she has to give the May back. And Inanna refuses. She refuses to give back the May. Now, interestingly, I think if Enki had sincerely wanted the May back, he could have just gone himself and taken them. He's a very powerful god. But Isimud is someone to whom Inanna could say yes or no. And she said no. And she pointed out that Enki was breaking his word and breaking his oath in requesting the May back. And so she kept traveling. And incidentally, so Isimud sends various challenges after her to try to retrieve the May. And interestingly enough, that happened 7 times. And 7 is the number of completion. That's why, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, the world was created in 7 days because this was a number of completion. It's also the number of Venus. It's also a number that was very, very important to Mesopotamians in terms of being a holy number and a magical number in Mesopotamian magic and religion. So I don't think it's at all a coincidence that Isimud challenges Inanna 7 times, and 7 times she overcomes these challenges and she arrives at Uruk with the May. And I think that this can be interpreted as an initiatory ordeal. And I think it's very tempting for people today to think about the people of ancient Mesopotamia and believe that they were very simple-minded. They were ancient people, right? So they were simple-minded. But if we look at their literature, we see a deep understanding of metaphor and of multiple meanings. And so I think when we look at this story, we're really seeing 2 stories. We're seeing a story of the transfer of power from Eridu to Uruk. And that is the obvious story. But there's also an occult story, a story whose meaning is not going to be recognized except by people who have the understanding to recognize it. And that's the story of Inanna's initiation. I think that at the beginning of the story, Inanna is the candidate for initiation. She survives her initiatory ordeal and she arrives back at Uruk. And in the story, at the end of the story, Enki repeatedly expresses admiration for Inanna. He's not angry. He doesn't go to war to try to get the May back. Instead, he actually says respect over and over. And then he says that he will establish a place for Inanna in his Abzu. And I see that as him acknowledging Inanna as his equal. You know, he's not Another thing to keep in mind is that in ancient Mesopotamia, the obligations between guest and host were very, very firmly entrenched in society. Okay. So for Inanna to have actually stolen something from her host would have been unforgivable, socially speaking. It would not have been a good story. And she would not have had success in the end, because if we actually look at ancient Mesopotamian stories about the obligations of guest and host, people who betray those obligations come to a bad end in the end of those stories. Likewise, if Enki had given a gift to a guest and then had sincerely tried to take it back, he would have been guilty of breaking the obligation of a host to a guest. And I think those are other clues. This guest and host relationship is another clue that this is not a story of theft. This is a story of Inanna being tested and passing that test by refusing to give back the May. This is my opinion as someone who's been involved in magic and ceremonialism for a very, very long time. And I think that, of course, I think I'm right. But that's the lens through which I am analyzing this story. And I actually see it as part of an initiatory cycle in Inanna's stories. If you look at the story of Inanna and the Halub tree, this is Inanna establishing her kingdom on earth. If you look at the story of Inanna and Enki, this is Inanna empowering and elevating that kingdom and also initiating into a higher level of, for lack of a better word, godhood. She comes back to Uruk a much more powerful god than she was when she first went to Eridu. And then, of course, the story of the descent is yet another story of initiation. This is her story of literally dying and then coming back to life. And I think we can actually look at all three of these stories as an initiatory cycle that plays out throughout. This is throughout, I don't want to say throughout Inanna's life, but throughout these stories of Inanna, I think even though I'm pretty sure that the story of the descent, the story of the Hulupu tree, I'm pretty sure it came later than the other stories. I would still say that in terms of as an initiatory drama, it is chapter 1. And Inanna and Enki is chapter 2, and Inanna and the Hulupu tree, I'm sorry, the descent of Inanna is chapter 3.
There's one thing that I wanted to dovetail that with. So you mentioned these foundational myths. There is one myth that I think could be dovetailed in, and that is the myth of Enki and the world order, where he essentially establishes the material world and ordains various things and brings them into being, and then he bestows the custodianship of these various domains upon various deities. And at the very end, having named all of these other deities, Inanna, as a young maiden, not as a goddess in her power, in her prime, Inanna, as a young maiden, approaches him and wants to know, what do I get? And so we see these elements. And what I find interesting is wherever Inanna is, it seems as though Enki is just 2 steps away. He's always in the background. He's like the man behind the curtain. Well, I don't want to say man behind the curtain because that implies that she doesn't have any power. He's the stagehand. He is the magician's assistant in this instance. And I find it so incredibly fascinating how, especially in modern conceptions of ancient cultures, that there's this idea that men and women, or gods and goddesses, are pitted against each other. But despite all of that, if we look at the way these two deities interact in the literary corpus alone, there is a dynamic. They have simpatico. They are not diametrically opposed to each other. They maintain and uphold the order of the universe. He just happens to have passed it on to her to maintain custodianship of. And we also see his presence in the descent myth is pivotal. My personal interpretation is if Inanna is in the underworld and she is dead, who is maintaining the May? Who
Mm.
is in control of the May? So we have Enki stepping up saying, essentially, well, shit, who's got, who's got the reins to this? Something has to be done. And I think that is what compels him to act because again, if we just look at these myths without keeping the cultural connotations and the context and the conceptions that the ancient Mesopotamian the conceptions that the Mesopotamian peoples had concerning their gods, we're missing a much bigger picture.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think really Enki's role here is as Inanna's benefactor and teacher throughout many of these stories. We can see him as her initiator, and she is his student. Um, Inanna comes to him and he gives May to lots of other people, but when Inanna comes to him and says, "Well, what do I get?" He's like, "Oh, don't you worry your pretty little head. You've got lots of other little things." And that could have been a challenge. It could have been a test. I'm going to tell her that she doesn't need to have anything else and see how she reacts to that. Is this someone who wants power and will demand it? Will they defend their right to have it? Or will they just walk away and be happy with whatever I give them? And which one of those two types of people, which one do you want to have ruling the universe?
And we see similarities in comparative literature. If we look at various biblical narratives, there's these tests of character, or there's these, interactions where, I'm not approaching you as an adversary. I'm approaching you, I don't want to say trickster, but I'm sure that conveys what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
I am a benevolent trickster. I am working to your benefit, but you have to prove yourself worthy of the gifts that I'm going to give you, or the power that I'm going to give you, or the position and authority that I'm going to give you.
Yes, and I think we absolutely see that in the story of Inanna and Enki, that by refusing to give back the May, she is proving herself worthy of holding them. She's defending her right to have them. She knows what's correct. She knows what she is entitled to. She knows that Enki used a magical formula in giving her these May, and that taking them back, he would be morally incorrect. And she knows all of that, and she defends her right to have them. And I think we also see the same thing in the story of Inanna and the Halud tree, which is that, Inanna initially goes to Utu to ask him for help in cutting down the tree. And he refuses, and she doesn't just, go home and cry about it. She persists and asks someone else to help her because this is important. It's important to establish her kingdom on earth. And she's going to persevere and keep asking until she finds someone who's going to help her do it.
Again, everyone has a dynamic. No one is diametrically opposed to the other. And I absolutely love that precedent in Mesopotamian literature. And it just indicates that the gods all work together in harmony, in unison. And, while they may have different aspects, they're all part of the same divine universal order that keeps everything, keeps the universal clock ticking.
And that is a great point. And I think it's another reason why it's so important that Inanna has to prove herself, because if she's going to have that power to maintain the divine order on earth, she really needs to show that she's worthy of wielding that, right? You're not just going to hand off May and rulership to any rando who shows up at your Abzu, right? So I think that there's so much, I really do think these stories are very rich, and there's so much more to them than people who don't have any experience of magic and ceremony are necessarily, like Samuel Noah Kramer, are necessarily going to see.
I agree. And I think it also speaks to the fact that when we look at a culture, in addition to looking at their literature, we need to look at the culture. We need to look at the social mores of that culture. We need to look at the customs of that culture. We need to look at the social dynamic within, the social hierarchy of that culture, because without seeing the big picture and we're just focusing on a minute detail, we're missing everything else that would inform us of what it is that we're actually reading.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another point, that the people of ancient Mesopotamia, for one thing, were probably not reading this story off of a tablet. They were probably hearing it recited by a performer at an event. And those people hearing this story would have been familiar with all these nuances that modern readers are not. They would know about the law of guest and host obligations. They would know that the word atamine means a debate, not a drinking contest. They would be much more aware of what the performer was talking about, and really more able to hear between the lines than a lot of us are today when we are trying to translate and trying to understand a language that's very different from most modern languages in terms of construction and in terms of reading it even.
And therein lies the rub.
It's a challenge. It really is a challenge for Reconstructionists, especially Reconstructionists like Mesopotamian recons who are working in a very niche environment. I think that there are some Reconstructionist traditions, like, for example, Kemetic, that have a ton of popular reference. There's just so much very accessible literature about ancient Egyptian religion and culture and society and life. And
You can buy the Book of the Dead for
yes,
$5 at Five and Below. It's
yes,
insane to me.
yes. Whereas we're dealing with something that's very niche, and until recently, most of the scholarship wasn't even available in English. So we were very, very reliant on, one of the reasons that Kramer became so popular is because he was writing for pop culture. He was writing and publishing books for the general public, not just for other academics. And he was writing in English. And so these were the books that were accessible. And so those are the books that people read and naturally believed. But I think we can, if we go back and look at the primary sources, we can see that his interpretations were not entirely accurate. And of course, we are all colored by our own lens. Of course, like I am colored by the lens of a magician who studied Western ceremonialism for more than 20 years, right? I'm colored by my lens of being someone who really just lives and breathes magic and spirituality all the time. And Kramer was colored by his lens. And I think in part, the lens he was colored by was a misogynist one, unfortunately.
Well, that does. I don't mean to say well, because that. Well, I'm excusing him. That certainly does come with the culture in which
Yeah.
he lived in, and the way academia was, established. It's unfortunate, and at the same time, I am thankful that we have moved away from that, because we see so many women in the field of Assyriology coming forth with their own treatises, their own theses, their own books, and it's outstanding to me.
Yes, I love that. I love that we're seeing more interpretations and more. It's not that Kramer wasn't educated. He was very formally educated, but we're seeing more interpretations from people who have a wider breadth of education. And they're able to bring that understanding to their interpretation of ancient Mesopotamian literature. And I think that's very, very valuable. We've seen, for example, in Roman and in anthropology, people studying Roman culture, there have been these statues with these hairstyles, statues of women with very elaborate hairstyles. And
Mm.
anthropologists were just absolutely convinced that these were imaginary hairstyles purely created for statues because they had no idea how to recreate them. And a cosmetologist, I think in the Midwestern US, heard about this and recreated them within a matter of weeks. Like she
Yeah,
looked at photos of the statues and was very easy to recreate them. But for decades, academics had been convinced that these weren't real hairstyles that anyone ever wore in real life. And that's an example of just bringing, a different background and different experienced knowledge to the table. And it can really make a breakthrough.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I love there's one individual who I would absolutely love to get on this channel, but they have they have declined. I think I've asked them probably two or three times. They have declined. But their focus is so broad. They have a master's in one field, a bachelor's in another, and a PhD in a different field, but they all overlap in such a way that it gives them insight into this broad spectrum of cultures and symbols of these cultures and how these cultures, perceive themselves and the world around them. And, we need more of that. We need more people eager to take out, a loan for a bachelor's and then a master's and then, pursue a PhD.
Yes.
If we were all born obscenely wealthy instead of stunningly gorgeous, I'm sure that, things would be so much easier. So in addition to all of your work, you've written this contribution for the Inannanthology. You have a very storied history within the Mesopotamian spiritual community as a reconstructionist, as a religionist, if you will. You are also a priestess in the Circle of Inanna. What's that about?
So the Circle of Inanna is a circle, it's an organization for women who are devotees of Inanna. And really, the Circle of Inanna came about because my life has changed so much. And the ways that I used to serve Inanna when I was in my 20s are not the same ways that I live and serve Inanna now. And so, and I should add that I really, really, really believe that worship is not just what you do at your altar. It's not just what you do during ceremony. It really should be how you live your life. And because of, my life has changed a lot. I am a monogamously married woman now. So the ways that I embody worship of Inanna are just going to be different than they were when I was a wild woman in my 20s, right? So I was really asking her, how can I serve you now? What it and her answer was the Circle of Inanna. And so the Circle of Inanna is a group of 4 women. We meet once a month, and our meetings are in a women's circle format. And every month I teach on a particular topic related to Inanna and her worship. Um, Depending on what time of year it is, it may be a seasonal ceremony or celebration. For example, we celebrated Inanna last year. We always celebrate the equinoxes. We celebrate Inanna at the equinoxes, actually. Um, and every month we talk about basically some topic or aspect related to Inanna's stories or her worship. And then we also have an embodiment practice that people take on for the next month related to that topic. Because I do believe that worship and devotion are the way that you live your life. We want to embody Inanna's values and embody Inanna's work in the world. And so every month we meet, we do a little ceremony. I teach on a topic. We have questions that we ask each other, and everyone shares on those questions, basically contributing their thoughts and ideas on the topic. And then at the end, we have an embodiment practice that everyone carries forward for the next month. The circle has been open since late 2021. And it's been amazing. The most amazing people join this circle, and I love it. I love the work. I love the women I've met through this circle. I really feel that Inanna has brought us just the absolute best people. Some of the women of the circle are academics. Um, we actually have two doctoral candidates right now. We have a professional author. We have, Amara and Enheduinanna, who you interviewed
Hmm.
recently for your podcast, are both members of the circle. They are just wonderful, wonderful people. And I look forward to it every month. And lately, when we're not doing a seasonal ceremony or having a special guest, in fact, you were one of our special guests once. We actually lately have been going through Inanna's May, um, which means that every month we look at one of the May from the story of Inanna and Enki. And in particular, we look back at what this May specifically meant to people in ancient Mesopotamia. You know, what did this mean to them? For example, righteousness and wickedness are two of the May, and we look at the word. It's the word in ancient Mesopotamian, its etymology, what it meant socially and culturally to people of ancient Mesopotamia, and then we look at what it means to us today. Like, how can we relate to that ancient Mesopotamian value and make it a part of the ways that we embody Inanna's work in the world today. And so we do that once a month, and I really love it. This year, I'm trying to think, one, two, three, four, five members presented or led ceremony at Ishtar Fest, which was great.
Yeah, I
Um,
was about to say you've also done Ishtar Fest.
Yes, I have presented Ishtar Fest, which I absolutely love, and I always encourage people in our community, the Mesopotamian Reconstructionist community, to get involved with Ishtar Fest, because that's also a great community, and people are just lovely. And it's also a really fun way to learn so much, because we often have academics who come and present at Ishtar Fest, so we learn from them. Um, and then also, I really think that Inanna's people are smart people. I found that over time, when you talk to people about how they came to Inanna, a lot of the people who come to worshiping Inanna come because she came to them somehow. She somehow contacted them or came to them in a dream or came to them in their life somehow. And, she often chooses her people. And I really think she chooses really smart people, because the women in the circle of Inanna are very smart, very dedicated people. And so naturally, I tell these really smart people, hey, you should present at Ishtar Fest. What you just said was brilliant. You should, do a presentation on that. So yeah, I really love the circle. It has been running since, I think our first circle was in September of 2021. So members have access to, they can come to the monthly meeting, which of course I want them to come to the monthly meeting, but if they can't make it to a meeting, all of the meetings are recorded, and we have an online archive of those that members can access. If they miss a circle, they can go back and watch it. If there's a particular lesson or May that they want to polish up on, they can go watch the circle that was on that from the past. Um, and then they also have access to all of my presentations from past Ishtar Fests. So they can watch those as well, and which includes one on what we just talked about, from Eridu to Uruk, Inanna's initiatory journey. There's also one about Inanna, which includes a pathworking style meditation at the end. And then there's also one called Greeting of Earth and Heaven, and it's about Inanna as a goddess of pleasure, and how the pleasurable sexual exchange between Inanna and Dumuzid is what makes the earth fertile and brings abundance into our lives. And so they have those three presentations that they can watch whenever they want to. And then they also have access to private coaching with me. I am a trained and certified life coach. I have multiple certifications. Which I decided to do because I really feel like if I'm going to be serving as a clergy person, if I'm going to be ministering to the people, not only ministering to the gods, I needed to get some kind of training. So I didn't want to just throw myself out there and, do something wrong and take the risk of hurting someone or messing up their life. I'm very concerned about that. And integrity is really, really important to me. And so I wanted to be sure that I had some kind of qualification to do what I'm doing. So members also have access to private coaching with me. at no extra charge. They can just make an appointment and we set it up, or they can email me, stuff like that. And it's been great. I'm hoping at some point in the near future that we can have a retreat and all get together in person and do some awesome magic together. And we'll see when that happens. And then in addition to the work of the Circle of Inanna, the work that I have been presenting to the Circle of Inanna on Inanna's May, I'm actually putting together into a book. And the book is tentatively titled The May of Inanna. And the book is pretty much what I'm talking about in the circle. It's about, what did these words and concepts mean to the ancient Mesopotamians? What purpose and role did they serve in Mesopotamian society? And what role and purpose and meaning can they have for us today? So I'm very excited about that. It's probably not going to be out until late 2026 at the very earliest, maybe 2027. But in the meantime, I'm planning to serialize the material that's going to be in the book in a series of videos, and it's going to be called May School.
Excellent.
And one of the reasons I'm doing that is because I often hear from people, especially men, who are interested in learning what I'm teaching to the Circle of Inanna, but for whatever reason, when I create a container for men, they just don't show up. I don't know why that is. Like, men say, oh, I want something like that. But when I offer something like that, they often don't show up.
I think there's a lot that, and I say this as a man, there's a lot that men bring. There's a lot of baggage that we have, especially in circles where we have to be vulnerable, or we are essentially taking a subordinate role to a woman. And I think a
Mm.
lot of that has to do with cultural norms. And that is unfortunate. And it's unfortunately created a generation of men who cannot, in any way, shape, or form, interact with women in a healthy manner.
Oh,
And
you're absolutely right.
it's one of the downfalls to Western society, and it's lamentable, absolutely lamentable.
I think you're right. It is very unfortunate because actually, gender aside, like whether a woman is leading the circle or not, I really think men benefit from vulnerability. One of the things that comes out of circle is that you learn that you're really not alone.
Right.
I like to say that circle is a mirror. Circle is a mirror that reflects our experience back to us. It is so shocking to me. Well, it was at first. It's not anymore. Now I'm like, yeah, here we go. But how, when we start sharing on a topic, how many of us will have had an experience that feels like a very lonely experience? And it turns out other people in the circle have had the same one. And especially today as we get older, it seems that like the older people get today, the more isolated they are, the fewer friends they have,
Yes.
and that can be so lonely. And that loneliness is very bad for your health.
I see that happening with my own father, and it's like
Mm.
he went from being someone who was involved in, various organizations, and we were always doing something like every weekend, and now he is largely isolated. He doesn't have any friends, and he
Oh,
spends most of his time watching horrible programming that has given him a warped sense of the world and the consensus of reality in which we inhabit. And it's so sad. So
it is
sad.
sad. And I think it is shortening our lives. It's reducing our quality of life. And one of the great things about Circle is that no matter who is there, if there are people you've never met before, you're probably not alone in whatever you've experienced, whether it's something positive and great or whether it's something scary and sad. And it really helps people to know that they are not alone in that experience. And also, people do make friends there, especially in the USA, where for many people, Christianity is such a huge part of their life. Um, it's really lonely to be a member of an alternate religion.
Yeah,
A lot of
absolutely.
people in some places feel as though they cannot tell the people around them what their religion is. They cannot talk about their spirituality with those around them. And being able to connect with other people in our circle has been so great for us to make really good friends that we can talk about these things with. For a while, I will go back to this eventually, but for a while I was leading free monthly worship meetings for members of the Temple of Inanna. Um, and I really saw how many people were just so desperately lonely for a religious community through that. And but I also saw how many men had a lot of difficulty with a woman leading a religious meeting. Even men who have professed to have left patriarchal religion behind and are devoted to Inanna had some of them had a really, really hard time with me leading the prayer meeting or the worship service because I am assigned female at birth. And they really struggled with that. Sometimes men would really come in and just try to take the whole thing over. They would really come into the meeting and decide that they were there to lead the worship meeting. And my thing is, we're all at different points on our journey of figuring our stuff out. And we're all figuring out where we are and what we think and how we're going to practice. And especially, I think people who are very new to Mesopotamian polytheism, they're still figuring so many things out.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. There's a lot to work with.
yeah, there is. And but the problem that a lot of men have with learning from or listening to women, of course, that goes back thousands of years, right? I mean, St. Paul said that women aren't supposed to speak in church, right? So, and we're
We
still
don't
dealing
talk
with
about
that
the
today.
imposter Paul.
uh, so we're still dealing with that today, and it's a big challenge. But I think that this information is important, honestly, for devotees of Inanna. I think that they deserve to know about the May, and they deserve to know what the May meant to ancient Mesopotamians, and they deserve to know ways to embody Inanna's values in their lives today.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I had the idea for May School. Instead of waiting for the book to come out to release this information, I'm planning to serialize it in a series of video lessons, basically, so that people will be able to have access to this information. And it'll also help me, honestly, it'll help keep me on a schedule. It'll help keep me moving forward toward publication of the book, instead of, getting distracted and being lazy and slacking off.
I get it. Speaking as someone who obviously is a published author, I found that when Rod and Ring was in its development stages, you whet people's appetites by giving them samples of the work. And I think that it really does help engage your intended audience, it really does help engage your target audience, and it also helps you refine what needs to be refined or redact what needs to be redacted. I think it's great when we have a living, breathing project instead of one that hasn't been tested or evaluated or gone through any initial stages with a target audience. I think that's when authors lose sight of that, and unfortunately it doesn't go well.
I agree. The questions that I get from people on social media who are following my work really help me to know what people need to know. Like, what questions do people have? I don't know what other people know and don't know. And, people like to talk disparagingly about the negative side of the Dunning-Kruger effect. But the other side of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that we just kind of assume everyone knows the same stuff that we do.
Right.
And so it really helps me to get questions from people because that tells me what they need to know and what I should include, what questions they need answered. So May School is probably going to include some kind of like a monthly office hours component or something like that where people can pop in and ask me questions. Because I love that, actually. I'm a big fan of community. And, that's something I really like to emphasize in my work is that, in ancient Mesopotamia, religion did not happen without community. There was nothing without community. There was no religious practice without the other people, whether in your home or your neighborhood or your city state, etc. It just, there was no religion without everyone else being involved along with you. And
Right.
I think religious community is so important. It's very easy, like I said, to be really lonely if you are practicing a niche religion that has a very small amount of people. Um, And honestly, it can feel even lonelier if you're with a bunch of other pagans, to be honest. Like it can feel really lonely to go to like a pagan gathering,
Hmm.
and find that none of the ceremonies happening there are relevant to your spirituality, or none of the talks and presentations are actually accurate or welcoming to you.
Emphasis on accurate.
Yeah, like in some cases, there's a big assumption that everyone follows the rule of three or the Wiccan Rede, right? Well, I don't follow either of those. And so, if you are someone who's new to polytheism and you go to a presentation and someone talks about how, well, we all, share these values, we all follow the rule of three. I think especially if you're a very young person who doesn't have a religious community, you might wonder if you're doing things wrong. You might feel really othered or unwelcome, or as though there isn't a place for you at all.
Right.
And so I think it's so important to make a place for people, which is why the Temple of Inanna has been great. The circle has been great. And the Mesopotamian uh, polytheist community these days is much larger than it was 20 years ago, and much more visible and very welcoming, in my opinion. And I think that's wonderful. People really need that.
Speaking of building community and talking about Ishtar Fest, there's one thing that Ali mentioned during my interview with her and Amara, and that was the dedication ceremony or the rededication ceremony that the both of you lead for. I can't recall how many years in a row it's been, but it's been a consistent uh, gathering and poignant moment during Ishtar Fest. What was it that led you to developing and presenting or facilitating that kind of space? Because when we think of rededication or dedication as a whole, there's a lot of Christian baggage, I guess, that comes with that. And as someone who has a devoted practice to Inanna, I do find the the call to worship, the call to community, and the call to open up a space for dedicants to present themselves as as would be supplicants. What was it that compelled you to facilitate that?
I have to be totally honest and say that Ali asked me. That was it. Like that, like that's what compelled me to participate was it was at Ishtar Fest 2021, and she messaged me saying, "Hey, I'm going to lead a dedication and rededication ceremony at Ishtar Fest. Would you like to co-lead it with me?" And that was really it. She was very kind to invite me in on this. Um,
She is
and
outstanding.
she is absolutely fantastic. She was actually my working partner throughout the initiatory cycle of the Rod and Ring book. And it was wonderful. It was really wonderful to go through all of that work with her. And she actually came to my home but she came here from where she lives to do our Great Feast of Heaven at the end of the cycle. And it was just wonderful. It was wonderful to share all of that work with her over the course of the year. She's absolutely fantastic. And this was actually before we'd begun that. And so we really barely knew each other. So it was very, very kind of her, in my opinion, to invite me to share that ceremony with her. Um, and I think she did it because of my history as a leader in the Mesopotamian religious community. But it was so kind of her, really. It was very generous. And so, yeah, it's been awesome, honestly. Since then, we have changed it a little bit. I brought in a little of my own ceremonial background, and it's just been wonderful. I think this year, I think we only had about 20 people, but I think last year we had something like 32 or 33. Like it was insane. It went on forever. And people, it really
That's
did.
a
It went
good
on a
thing.
long time. Yeah, it went a long time. Like when they ask us at Ishtar Festival, how much time do you have for this? We're like, oh, we're gonna need 2 hours. And they're shocked, but like, yes, we are gonna need 2 hours, And one thing I love about it is how beautiful and moving it is to the participants. We've been doing it for 4 years now, and some of the people have been coming every year since 2021. And we have people in tears. And I think, I have a background in the arts. I went to art school, and the role of the witness in art is something that gets talked about a lot, but I don't think it really gets talked about enough in other situations. And I think that for a lot of the participants, being witnessed in their declaration of devotion to our goddess and being celebrated in their declaration of devotion to our goddess is very meaningful, especially for people for whom this has been a very, very lonely path. So, I
Yes,
mean, I
absolutely.
myself have cried multiple times during this ceremony, and I've seen so many people in tears. I've seen people really ecstatic. It's just a beautiful, beautiful ceremony. But I have to really give all credit for it to Enheduinanna. It was her idea. She created the whole thing. And I am fortunate enough to be brought along for the ride. And I really, really love it. I think it's so important. It's important to have that opportunity for people to have that participation in a community event. And it's very deeply spiritual.
And that is vital to our human existence.
Yes, it really is. I mean, I think if we look at the earliest, okay, so there is a tendency in anthropology to call any object whose use they don't understand, oh, it must have been a spiritual object. It must have been for magical purposes. It must have been a spiritual, a religious fetish. Like we see that all the time. If they don't know what it was for, oh, it must have been a religious
Like
object.
that stone dildo that was found.
Yes, yes, yeah. Well, I'm sure someone saw God. So it was,
More than
so
once. More than
yes.
once.
So it was a religious object, right? But yeah, we see this all the time, right? So there is this tendency. But I actually do think that for whatever reason, the religious impulse seems to be baked in to the human brain and human culture. And I think we see this especially when we look at end of life experiences,
Definitely.
which you should talk to Enheduinanna about because she is an end of life doula and does amazing work. Um, but if we look at end of life experiences, there's this very common thread of what happens in the human brain near death. And it often involves seeing loved ones who have been deceased before. It
Hmm.
often involves an experience of visiting an afterlife. Um, so it appears that there is some kind of religious experience or religious impulse that is baked into our neurology somehow, and possibly baked into our society. But I think it's really probable that society came first and the religious impulse was so strong that it became a part of society, and then they kind of reinforced each other over time.
Yeah, I can see that.
If you look at the theory that religion and gods began with veneration of the dead, we can really see how, you know, the social aspect of mourning and grieving our dead can kind of, can be compounded and enhanced by the religious impulse. And then we can
Hmm.
see them kind of feeding into each other, and then we end up with gods and religion.
So, as we come to a close, you have already spilled the beans about your main project. What other projects are on the horizon, or what other things would you like to plug and tease the audience with?
Well, something I really want to plug is my energy medicine practice because it's so meaningful and powerful to me. I should add that, like, as a teacher, when I am teaching people about devotional magic or even about any kind of spiritual magic at all, I'm really, really, really not teaching spell casting or that kind of thing. I'm not teaching manifestation or spell casting. Our goal in the Circle of Inanna is to enhance our devotional practices to Inanna and become close to her in terms of that, building that intimate relationship. And um, and with my energy medicine practice, I practice Entheos energy medicine, which is a tradition based very much on Taoist practices. And it's really not just it starts with healing. It starts with your healing, but it leads to such expansion of your relationship with the divine. And that's why I love this work so much. And so that's something I really want to plug, because just the results I have seen and the people I have worked on, they've just been phenomenal. And I actually tend to be pretty skeptical about a lot of woo-woo things, which may surprise people because, I'm a polytheist who serves a goddess. But for many years, I wanted to be educated in some form of energy medicine, because while you can really brute force it, you can brute force a lot of things, right? You can just trial and error your way through so many things. I don't think it's super ethical to trial and error your way through doing energy medicine on another person. But when it comes to working on someone else, I just don't think it's ethical, to be like, all right, let's try this and see how it works. So I really wanted to have a formal teaching program, and I wanted to learn from someone who had some credibility. And so when my teacher, Brianna, decided to open Spirit Medicine Academy, I know a lot of people who I really trust who had worked with her in energy medicine, and those are people who have integrity and who I know are also somewhat skeptical. And so that made me trust that this would be a good program for me. And then what has further reinforced that is just the amazing results that I get when I work on people. It never gets old. It never stops blowing my mind how real and effective this work is. And so I really want to plug that because that's really the other main part of what I'm doing these days in terms of my ministry, is focusing on my work serving Inanna through the Circle of Inanna and now through May School. And then the other piece has been my work in energy medicine, which I really genuinely just love. I love doing it. I love it so much. It's the best. I really feel like this work has been waiting for me to come along and do it. In 2009, when I was in my mid-30s, I reconnected with a woman who had been my caregiver when I was a very little child, from when I was about 3 until I was about 6 or 7. And I had not seen her since then. And she is a charismatic Christian. And she told me at that time, she said, I always knew that I would see you again because God gave me a message for you. And at the time, let's see, I was in my mid-30s. I was really looking for what I was going to do next with my life. And so it just, I felt kind of unmoored. And so it was really synchronous that she came back into my life at this time and told me this. And so I asked her, what is the message that God gave you to give to me? And she's one of these people who had all these stories from my childhood of me telling her something was about to happen right before it did, or opening my mouth and saying things that were just preternaturally wise for a toddler to pop up and say to you. And most of these are things that I don't remember, but she remembers them very clearly. And so she said, well, you know how sometimes you know what's going to happen before it does? And I said, yes. And she said, you know how sometimes you know things about people without them telling you? And I said, yes. And she said, well, that is a gift from God. And God gave you that gift so that you could use it to help people. And ever since she told me that, I have really been looking for the way to use that gift to help people. And the first piece of that was getting my coaching certification and moving into service as a priestess. But energy medicine has really been the second piece, and it allows me to serve and help people in such a powerful way. And as soon as I started doing this work, because my certification actually was a year-long process. It was a year-long course, which involved a lot of practice on my classmates and then lots of feedback and lots of work with my instructor. And as soon as I started practicing, it just felt like this was the work that had been waiting for me to come along and do it. And so yeah, it's very important to me, and I just love doing it. And if people are interested in working with me on that, they can find me on Facebook, or they can come to my website, which is priscalong.com.
Excellent. I will be sure to put those links in the description of the video.
Thank you. And that's also the way to get involved with the Circle of Inanna, and coming soon, May School. You can contact me through either of those.
What parting words would you like to leave with viewers and listeners?
Um, there are so many. I have a lot of words.
We've said a lot of words during the course of this episode.
We did, yeah, and we could say more. Really, that I think, as I've said it before in this video, but I think it's so important to remember that worship, the way, at least in Mesopotamian polytheism, we are not here to promote a particular belief. This is not a faith-based religion, but what we are here for is to try to build intimate devotional relationships with the gods. And that means the way you live your life. It's not just what you do at your altar. It's not just what you do when you're performing a ceremony. Your life is the prayer.